Tonight, you probably opened a refrigerator. You pulled something out without thinking. You ate it without knowing where it came from, who grew it, or what season it belongs to. That moment, that effortless, thoughtless moment, is one of the most radical things a human being has ever done. Because for most of human history, eating was not effortless, it was not thoughtless. It was the entire point of being alive. So, what did the people who first figured out farming actually put in their mouths? What did a day of eating look like 10,000 years ago, when the whole idea of growing your own food was still brand new? The answer is stranger than you think, and it will change the way you look at every meal you eat today. Start with this. When you picture ancient farming communities, you probably imagine abundance. Fields of grain, overflowing baskets, the beginning of civilization. But archaeologist Amanda Mummert published research in 2011 that completely reframed this picture. She and her colleagues analyzed skeletal remains from dozens of early agricultural populations around the world. What they found was unexpected. Early farmers were shorter than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Their bones showed signs of nutritional deficiency. Their teeth were riddled with cavities in ways that pre-agricultural skeletons simply were not. The first farmers, it turns out, were not eating better than the people who came before them. In many ways, they were eating worse. How is that possible? How do you invent the food system that feeds the entire modern world and somehow end up less nourished than the people who never planted a single seed? To understand that, you have to understand what they were actually eating. The foundation of almost every early agricultural diet was a single grain. In the Fertile Crescent, it was emmer wheat and einkorn. In China, it was millet, then rice. In Mesoamerica, it was maize. In sub-Saharan Africa, it was sorghum. These were not the hybridized, nutrient-enriched, carefully selected grains you find in a modern grocery store. They were tough, hull-covered, labor-intensive seeds that required hours of processing just to make edible. Your ancient farming ancestor woke up before sunrise. The first task of the day was often the grain. You threshed it to separate the seeds from the stalks. You winnowed it to blow away the chaff. You ground it between two stones, a process called milling on a quern, working the upper stone back and forth until you had something resembling flour. Archaeologists have found evidence of this in the wear patterns on ancient farmers' bones. The women of early Neolithic farming communities in particular showed severe deformations in their knees, toes, and lower backs, the physical signature of hours spent kneeling over a grinding stone every single day for their entire lives. The grain became porridge, or flatbread baked on a hot stone. That was breakfast. That was often lunch. That was on many days dinner. But grain alone cannot keep a person alive. Not healthily, anyway. It lacks certain amino acids. It is low in fat-soluble vitamins. It can actually bind to minerals like zinc and iron, making them harder for your body to absorb, a process driven by compounds called phytates. This is partly why Mummert's farmers showed signs of iron deficiency anemia. They were eating more food by volume than their ancestors, but their bodies were pulling less nutrition from it. So what else went into the pot? Legumes. Everywhere that grain appeared, legumes followed. Lentils in the Middle East, soybeans in China, black beans and squash in the Americas. This was not accidental. Legumes and grains complement each other at the amino acid level in a way that produces something close to complete protein. The people who discovered this did not know anything about amino acids, but they noticed over generations that eating both together kept people stronger. The combination became cultural. It became ritual. It became the peasant food of every civilization on Earth. Rice and beans, bread and lentil soup, corn and black beans, because it worked. The vegetables were whatever the season allowed. And that word season is the one your modern brain has the most trouble fully grasping. There was no season that did not matter. There was no off-season. Every ancient farmer's diet moved in a rhythm that was completely governed by the agricultural calendar. Spring meant sprouting greens, the first wild plants pushing through thawing soil, or the earliest cultivated shoots of onion and garlic. Summer brought cucumbers, leafy plants, figs in the Mediterranean, early pulses. Autumn was the harvest, grain, legumes, root vegetables, the pressing of olive oil, the crushing of grapes. Winter meant stored food, dried grain, dried legumes, pickled or fermented vegetables, cured meat if you were lucky enough to have it. Anthropologist Richard Wrangham, whose work on cooking and human evolution spans decades, has argued that the control of fire and the cooking of food fundamentally reshaped the human digestive system. Cooking breaks down cell walls, pre-digests starches, and makes calories more bioavailable. Ancient farmers understood none of this biochemistry, but they cooked everything they could. The hearth was not decorative. It was the center of survival. You cooked your grain into porridge because raw grain is nearly impossible to digest in quantity. You cooked your legumes because many of them are toxic if eaten raw. You cooked your meat because it lasted longer and went further. Meat, by the way, was not an everyday thing for most ancient farmers. This is another point where your modern assumptions need recalibrating. In contemporary Western diets, meat appears at almost every meal. In early agricultural communities, a farmer might eat meat a handful of times per month, if that. Domesticated animals were too valuable alive to slaughter casually. Your cow gave you milk. Your sheep gave you wool. Your ox pulled your plow. You did not eat your tools. Meat came from animals that had outlived their productive usefulness, or from the occasional feast tied to a religious ceremony, a harvest celebration, or a death. Pigs were the exception, kept specifically for eating, fed on scraps, and pork appears in the archaeological record of early farming communities across the Old World, precisely because pigs gave nothing while alive except growth. Fish, where available, filled the protein gap. Inland farming communities near rivers show evidence of significant fish consumption in their midden heaps, the ancient equivalent of a trash pile, which archaeologists treat as a window into daily life. Coastal communities relied on shellfish and sea fish. But if you lived on the interior plains of early Anatolia or the lowest plateaus of ancient China, you ate almost no animal protein beyond occasional pork, dairy, and the eggs of domesticated birds. Dairy deserves its own moment. The first farmers who domesticated cattle did not drink fresh cow's milk. Most of them could not. Lactose tolerance, the ability to digest milk sugar into adulthood, is a genetic mutation that appears in the archaeological and genomic record only after thousands of years of cattle domestication. Early farming populations across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia were predominantly lactose intolerant. They drank milk anyway, because the calories and fat were too valuable to waste. But they processed it first. They let it ferment. They turned it into yogurt, into kefir, into early forms of cheese. Fermentation breaks down much of the lactose. It also preserves the milk. It also creates beneficial bacteria that improve gut function. Again, they did not know any of this. They discovered it by accident, kept doing it because it worked, and in doing so accidentally invented one of the most nutritionally important food preservation technologies in human history. Bread, too, was not what you think it was. Researcher Maria Entino, studying early Neolithic food production sites in Greece, found evidence that the flatbreads and early leavened breads of ancient farming communities were made with a far more diverse mixture of grains and seeds than we typically assume. Early bread was not white. It was not soft. It was dense, dark, flecked with bran and seed husks, and it contained more fiber, more minerals, and more complex carbohydrates per gram than nearly anything you can buy in a modern supermarket. The grinding stone introduced small fragments of grit into the flour, actual stone particles, and ancient skulls showed dramatic tooth wear as a result. Every meal took something from you. And then there were the hunger gaps. This is the part of ancient farming life that tends to disappear from the romantic version. Between the spring planting and the summer growth, in the weeks just before the harvest, food ran short. The stored grain from the previous autumn was running low. The new crops were not yet ready. This period, sometimes called the hungry gap, sometimes the lean season, recurred every single year in agricultural communities around the world. It was predictable and it was brutal. Caloric intake dropped, people grew thin. Children were the most vulnerable. Historical records from medieval farming communities, which inherited the same agricultural rhythms, document the lean season so consistently that it became embedded in the culture. In folk sayings, in religious fasting calendars, in the timing of festivals that were deliberately placed at the end of the hungry gap to mark survival and return to abundance. Your ancestors did not just grow food. They rationed it, worried about it, prayed over it, and built their entire social calendar around its rhythms. Historian Massimo Montanari, whose scholarship on the history of European food spans the medieval and early modern periods, has written that food in agricultural societies was never simply sustenance. It was status. The ability to eat meat marked social rank. The quality of your grain, whether you ate whole grain rough bread or white refined flour, was a direct signal of your position in the hierarchy. Peasant farmers ate the dark bread because they had no choice. The elite ate refined white bread and were, ironically, often less nourished as a result, since the refining process stripped away the very bran and germ that contained most of the nutrition. The ancient farmer at the bottom of the social order, eating their coarse whole grain porridge and lentil soup, was in some ways better fed than the lord eating white bread in the manor house above them. Power and nutrition have never mapped neatly onto each other. What did this diet do to the body over a lifetime? It built a kind of resilience that modern bodies rarely have to develop. Ancient farming communities showed high rates of joint disease, spinal degeneration, and dental caries, the physical cost of hard labor and high carbohydrate, abrasive diets. But they also showed remarkable muscular development, dense bone structure in the load-bearing limbs, and metabolic adaptations to caloric restriction that modern science is only beginning to understand. The human body, under the conditions of early agriculture, became extraordinarily efficient. It stored fat when food was available. It ran lean when it was not. That efficiency is now working against you. When you open that refrigerator tonight, when you pull out food without thinking, in a world of permanent abundance and year-round access to every calorie imaginable, your body responds the way 10,000 years of agricultural scarcity trained it to respond. It stores, it craves dense calories. It treats every meal as if the hungry gap is coming, because for the vast majority of human history, it was. You are not broken. You are not undisciplined. You are the descendant of people who survived famine, drought, and the lean season, year after year, generation after generation, because their bodies were astonishingly good at holding on. Tonight, when you eat without thinking, remember the farmer who ground grain before dawn. Remember the lentil soup. Remember the hungry gap. Remember that the ease of the moment you are in right now is the most unusual thing any human being has ever experienced. The refrigerator you opened without thinking was 10,000 years in the making.